Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in and buckle up, because today's story is going to take you from the corridors of power in Washington, all the way to the heart of Africa's capitals. The headline: Ibrahim controls G20 room, releases CIA documents, live. Markets crash instantly. A bold, explosive, and dramatic. But beneath that headline lies a tangled web of geopolitical intrigue, economic shockwaves, and global power plays. In this video, we're going to unpack a sweeping narrative that connects secret intelligence, sudden market turbulence, and shifting power dynamics across continents. We'll first dig into what's happening in Africa, from trade shocks to internal crises, then pivot to the United States, where markets, politics, and intelligence are colliding in new ways. After that, we'll compare the two theaters, highlight the cross-influences, and wrap with a clear-eyed conclusion: where we are now, and where we might be headed. Let's get into it. First, imagine the scene. A dramatic live moment in the G20 room. Ibrahim, we'll treat this as a symbolic figure, commands attention, releasing a tranche of CIA documents on live feed. The effect is instantaneous: shock, chaos, and global markets reeling. Whether that precise moment happened or is a narrative exaggeration, it frames a theme. Intelligence disclosures can trigger seismic reactions. In our world today, the intersection of secrets, power, and money is very real. So let's first locate ourselves in Africa, where many of those secret threads lie. Africa: pressure, fallout, and fragile resilience. Trade shock, collapse of AGOA. One of the central pivots right now is the expiry of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA. For decades, AGOA had given many African countries duty-free access to U.S. markets for thousands of goods, especially in textiles, apparel, agro-products, and more. But as of September 30, 2025, AGOA expires unless renewed. What does this mean on the ground? Immediate tariff burdens snap back. Kenyan exporters, for instance, face sudden shocks. United Aryan, a major textile manufacturer in Nairobi supplying brands like Levi's and Wrangler to U.S. retailers, has already warned of layoffs in light of resumed tariffs. In South Africa, the situation is even more fraught. The US has already imposed reciprocal tariffs of 30% on South African exports, which many argue erode AGOA's theoretical benefits. South Africa had been elevated to permanent G20 membership and is now presiding over the G20, giving it a platform to push African priorities. But that position also exposes it to retaliatory pressures from larger powers, especially in a polarized geopolitical environment. The result: economic uncertainty, job losses, investor flight, and political stress. Thousands of jobs in textile, apparel, agriculture, and light manufacturing are at risk across sub-Saharan Africa. Internal crises, debt governance. Beyond trade, many African nations are grappling with deeper structural crises. Take Burundi, now described as enduring perhaps the worst economic crisis in a country not at war. Inflation, collapse of public services, limited foreign aid, donor fatigue. These are not new. But when global shocks amplify them, the effect is magnified. Political legitimacy is also fragile in many states. Protests over governance, corruption, resource mismanagement, climate stress, and security threats continue to simmer. In several countries, you see pushback against elite entrenchment and rising demands from younger populations. Meanwhile, resource dependencies remain a double-edged sword. African states rich in minerals, oil, or critical raw materials, cobalt, lithium, rare earths, etc., are under pressure from external powers seeking access, often on conditions that perpetuate dependency or extractive bargains. One noteworthy dimension is U.S. intelligence profiling of African leaders. Declassified records reveal that the CIA has long maintained visit pieces profiling African heads of state ahead of their U.S. trips. These profiles shape U.S. diplomatic posture and soft power engagement. Behind closed doors, such documents influence decisions about who gets U.S. support, which regimes are prioritized, and which are marginalized. Add to this the revelation of secret CIA operations in Africa drawn from newly declassified JFK assassination documents, which include U.S. wartime and surveillance operations across the continent. These historical patterns still resonate today in trust deficits, suspicion of external machinations, and nationalistic pushback. Signs of hope, small gains, and resilient pockets. It's not all doom. There are glimmers. In South Africa, the manufacturing PMI, Purchasing Managers Index, rose in September to 52.2, showing expansion in activity. Domestic demand is holding up in some sectors, even as external pressures loom. Also, the South African rand has held relatively steady around 17.23 per US dollar, as markets sway anxiously for developments on AGOA and US political dynamics. That said, that stability is precarious. Some African economies are attempting to diversify trading partners, stronger ties with China, India, and intra-African trade. But shifting supply chains, building infrastructure, and creating value-added manufacturing is a long, capital-intensive journey. So Africa today is in a state of tension, caught between external shocks, fractured internal systems, and the urgent need for transformation. But every shock also tests resilience, and that is where Africa's story still has potential for rebirth. United States, intelligence, markets, and the politics of disruption. Now turn our gaze to the US, where the drama is no less intense, whether in boardrooms, in intelligence agencies, or the Wall Street trading floors. Market meltdown, tariffs, panic correction. In early April 2025, the US stock market crashed globally, trillions in value evaporated. The trigger, sweeping tariffs announced by President Trump under what he coined Liberation Day. Nearly all imported goods faced levies, sending shock through global supply chains. On April 2 alone, the Dow dropped over 1,344.5 points, 3.22%, and the S&P 500 lost 176.96 points, 3.15%. The coordinated sell-off spread globally. US markets hemorrhaged $3 trillion in value in just days. By April 7, the drop had worsened. European equities down 10%, global markets tumbling. Commodity prices sank. Oil, copper, agricultural commodities all declined. The US responded by pausing some tariff increases around April 9, triggering a rebound in markets. By May 13, the S&P 500 had recovered to turn positive for the year. The rebound, however, masked deeper anxiety. Markets remain volatile, and investor confidence fragile. Further jolts followed. In August 2025, a weak U.S. jobs report, only 73,000 new jobs. Upward revisions reversed prior gains, combined with fresh tariff threats to unsettle markets again. The Dow plunged 1,679 points, the worst single-day drop since 2020. Internationally, global markets mirrored the panic. Those developments stoked fears of recession, heightened inflation expectations, and forced central banks to confront contradictory pressures. Intelligence leaks, covert operations, power plays. Simultaneous to market tremors, the world of intelligence and secrecy is under renewed spotlight. The recently declassified JFK assassination files have revealed not just historically interesting facts but operational insights about CIA interventions in Africa and elsewhere. For example, the CIA's covert funding of strikes in British Guiana, then part of the colonial world, is laid bare, and broader covert operations in Congo, Cuba, and Southeast Asia are accounted. These revelations feed into a narrative that the U.S. intelligence apparatus shape the global post-war order in deep, secret ways that still carry consequences today. Separately, leaks in more recent times, such as the Pentagon leak in 2023, exposed U.S. intelligence assessments on Russia, Ukraine, and global affairs. Those leaks showed how intelligence assessments, when exposed, can reshape public diplomacy, trust, and even alliances. In our Ibrahim releases CIA documents live framing, the implication is that a single leak or disclosure can destabilize trust, rattle governments, and, as our narrative states, shock markets. That's not just dramatic fiction. The lines between intelligence and markets are real, especially in a hyper-connected, high-leverage world. On the political front, the US is wrestling with internal divisions, fault lines in Congress, trade wars, debates over executive authority, and distrust over how intelligence is wielded. These tensions amplify any external shock, making markets more sensitive, diplomacy more fraught, and global signaling more volatile. Comparing Africa and the United States, two sides of a global coin. At first glance, Africa and the US may seem worlds apart in scale, capacity, and influence. But under the surface, their dynamics are increasingly intertwined, and the balance of influence often flows in both directions. Shock transmission contagion. A tariff shock from the US doesn't stay in the US, it ripples outward. When the US imposes sudden tariff barriers or makes big macroeconomic moves, it distorts global trade flows. African exporters relying on access to US markets suffer. That's happening now with AGOA's expiry and US tariff impositions. African firms lose margins, invest less, lay off workers, and the ripple could feed back into global supply chains. Conversely, African instability, whether in resource supply, geopolitical alignment, or regional conflict, matters to US markets and security interests. Disruptions in oil, minerals, critical metals, or supply chains can feed into commodity prices, investment risk premia, and strategic calculations in Washington. Power asymmetry is leverage. In the US, the framework of power is consolidated: strong institutions, deeper markets, global reserve currency, a large intelligence complex. US moves have systemic impact. Africa, in contrast, often responds rather than leads. Low leadership is emerging. African elites, regional blocs, and the African Union are striving for more voice, but structural asymmetries remain. Yet we see shifts. South Africa as G20 president, African states pushing for trade reciprocity, skepticism of external conditionality, and attempts to pivot toward intra-African and South-to-South partnerships. The concept of agency is increasingly asserted, particularly when external shocks threaten autonomy. Secrets, trust sovereignty. In the US, intelligence disclosure is dangerous, but infrastructure exists to manage the fallout: courts, oversight, media. In many African states, intelligence, secrecy, external influence, and corruption are entwined with trust deficits and legitimacy challenge. A leak, like Ibrahim releases CIA files, in an African context might destabilize governments more dangerously, because the institutional buffers are thinner. Yet both continents face the same challenge: how do you manage secrets responsibly in an age of digital leaks, mass distribution, and political polarization? If intelligence is weaponized or weapon leaks are weaponized, the consequences are profound for both US power and Africa's sovereignty. Economic divergence, interdependence. The US can absorb shocks better: federal tools, monetary firepower. Africa has less fiscal space, more vulnerability to external financing shifts, currency volatility, and capital flight. Yet African economies are more dependent on trade access, foreign direct investment, and external markets. That asymmetry means US decisions have outsized leverage over African futures. Still, Africa's resource endowments, demographic potential, and geographic significance give it strategic weight. Countries that can stabilize, diversify, and assert agency can shift the balance in subtle ways over time. Conclusion: after the shock, what next? So, where does that leave us? Let me walk you through several key takeaways and possible futures anchored by our dramatic framing. Ibrahim controlling the G20 room, releasing CIA documents, markets crashing, not as literal truth, but as metaphor for the moment. 1. Secrecy is a powerful detonator. Leaks or disclosures of sensitive intelligence have the potential to cascade into political, economic, and diplomatic crises. That's true in the US and especially fragile in Africa. 2. Global markets are far more sensitive than many believe. We've witnessed that what happens in Washington, tariff shocks, policy pivots, leak exposure can trigger panics from New York to Nairobi. 3. Africa is at a crossroads, with a go expiring, mounting global headwinds, and internal pressures of governance and debt. African nations must pivot. The way forward lies in diversifying trade, strengthening institutions, building resilient value chains, and asserting strategic autonomy even as external forces press in. 4. Interdependence demands prudent power. The US cannot act in a vacuum. Decisions made in Washington echo globally. Hence, wisdom and restraint in trade and intelligence strategy should be a priority. Lest every executive order or tariff be a trigger for global turmoil. 5. The moment of unveiling is never the beginning, but it changes everything. Whether it's Ibrahim releasing CIA documents live or a real declassification or leak, the act of revelation forces reconfiguration of alliances, narrative, reputations, and power balances. In closing, we live in an age where information is potency. The leak is a weapon. The trade war is a battlefield. Africa and the US are locked in a dynamic where actions in one theater reverberate across the globe in real time. And whether Ibrahim controls the G20 room is literal, symbolic, or fictional, the message is clear: control of knowledge equals power, and whoever can maneuver that control, reshapes the world.